The cradle. She rocked, outlived the cannons, the cradle that survived the first night of fire. The first night of fire did not begin with flames, but with silence, a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest as if it had weight. She had known that war was coming. Everyone had known, in whispers, in rationed bread, in the absence of laughter, that once filled the streets, but no amount of forewarning could have prepared her for the way the sky cracked open. The first cannon thundered at the edge of the horizon, and then the night itself became a battlefield. Windows shattered, dogs howled, mothers clutched their children closer. She sat in the corner of her small room, her arms wrapped around the cradle, rocking it slowly, deliberately, as though the motion alone could hold back the chaos. The cradle was not new. Its wood was worn smooth by years of use, carrying the weight of generations before her. Her grandmother had rocked her mother in it, and her mother had rocked her. The wood smelled faintly of earth and old fires, of nights spent near hearths where the world felt safe. When she first placed her child inside it, she had run her hands along its edges, whispering prayers into its frame, as though it could hear her. That night, as the first bombs shook the ground beneath her feet, she prayed again. Not words, but the steady rhythm of her hands, pushing and pulling, a lullaby made of movement. Outside, the cannons roared, a language of violence written across the sky. Each blast rattled the windows, shook dust from the ceiling, made her heart leap painfully against her ribs. But inside, the cradle rocked. The sound of wood creaking softly against the floorboards became her anchor. Her child whimpered, stirred, and then settled again, soothed not by silence. There was none left, but by the constancy of her arms. She realized in that moment that the cradle was not only for the child, it was for her. Each motion steadied her breathing, slowed her racing thoughts, reminded her that life still pulsed within those walls. The night stretched endlessly, a tapestry woven from terror and defiance. Flames rose in the distance, casting an orange glow against the walls. Shadows of chaos flickered through the cracks of the shutters, but she did not look. Her eyes remained fixed on the cradle, on the small bundle inside it, on the rise and fall of a tiny chest that proved the world had not ended yet. Rocking became an act of faith, each movement a declaration. You will live, you will sleep, you will see another dawn. She thought of all the mothers across the land, each in their own houses, each with their own cradles, some made of wood, some of cloth, some nothing more than arms folded around fragile bodies. She imagined them rocking too, synchronized across distances, their rhythm a silent resistance stronger than cannons. Perhaps the generals believed they were remaking the world with fire, but the truth was here, in the small motions of women who refused to let the future slip away. At one point, the blast of a cannon struck so close that the floor trembled, and the cradle lifted for a heartbeat, as though the earth itself had tried to snatch it away. She tightened her grip, steadying it, whispering through clenched teeth, "No, you stay, you stay." Her child did not wake. The innocence of sleep in such a night seemed miraculous, as if the cradle itself had woven a shield around him. She looked at his face, soft and unaware, and tears burned in her eyes. For him, she would rock until her arms gave out, until her body collapsed. For him, she would hold the world together with nothing but wood and love. Hours passed. Neighbors screamed, soldiers shouted, fire cracked in the distance, and still she rocked. The rhythm became part of her body, so constant that she no longer felt her own fatigue. She thought of her grandmother's hands, strong and lined, rocking the same cradle in another time. She thought of her mother, singing softly while pushing the wood back and forth. She thought of herself as a child, cradled in the same space, safe in a world that now seemed impossible. The cradle carried not just her child, but an entire lineage, a chain of survival linking past to present to future. By the time the cannons fell silent, the sky was bruised with smoke and ash, The first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the shutters, pale and trembling. She looked down at her child, still asleep, his tiny hand curled into a fist. Her arms ached, her back throbbed, her throat was raw from holding back sobs. But the cradle had survived. The child had survived. And she had survived. She stood slowly, her body stiff, and carried the cradle to the window. Opening the shutters, she let the smoke-filled air sting her eyes. The village outside was scarred, buildings broken, streets littered with debris. Yet in her hands the cradle glowed softly in the light of dawn, as if it carried not just a child but a promise. She whispered, barely audible, "You outlived the cannons. You will always outlive them." In that moment, she understood something deeper than survival. The cannons had power, yes. They could shatter walls, burn houses, destroy lives, but they could not rock a cradle. They could not soothe a child into sleep. They could not preserve memory across generations. That power belonged to her, to mothers, to women whose hands carried the weight of tomorrow, even as the world crumbled around them. The generals could burn maps, redraw borders, fire their cannons into the night, but the cradle endured. And in its endurance, so did she. That morning, as the sun rose weakly against a sky still streaked with ash, she laid her head beside the cradle and finally closed her eyes. She slept not because the world was safe, but because the world inside her arms was still alive, and in that fragile truth, she found strength. The cradle had survived the first night of fire, and as long as it rocked, she knew she would too. Her lullabies covered the noise of war. The second night was worse than the first. The cannons did not pause to let dawn breathe. They thundered through darkness as though determined to erase the rhythm of life itself. The ground shuddered with each strike. The air shook and the walls of her small home groaned under invisible fists. She thought she had grown accustomed to the noise of war, but there is no such thing. Each blast was new, each explosion a betrayal of the earth. And yet, within those walls, a cradle rocked, and a lullaby rose to meet the noise. She had not sung since before the war. Her voice had been buried under silence, swallowed by fear, locked away in a chest of forgotten joys. But as her child stirred in the cradle, as his small face twisted with unease at the thunder outside, something ancient awoke in her. She did not think. She opened her mouth, and the melody spilled out. Soft at first, hesitant, like a flame trying to catch against damp wood. Then stronger, steadier, until it filled the room. The lullaby was not hers alone. It belonged to generations. She remembered her mother singing it to her on nights when storms rattled the shutters. She remembered her grandmother's trembling voice, humming it while she sat near the hearth. It was older than her, older than war. A song carried through time like a thread that refused to break. The words were simple, almost forgotten, but the tune wrapped itself around her child like a blanket. The cannons roared, but her song did not stop. Each time the sky cracked open, she sang louder, not in volume, but in presence, in intention. Her voice trembled, but she did not allow it to falter. The melody became her shield, her weapon, her defiance. "You will not take this from me," she thought, as she leaned closer to the cradle. "You can burn the fields, tear down the houses, silence the bells, but you will not silence a mother's song." Her child's breathing steadied, his small fists unclenched. His lips parted slightly as he slipped back into sleep. She kept singing, not because he needed it now, but because she did. The song anchored her, reminded her of who she was before the war had reduced life to hunger and fear. In her voice, she felt the weight of every woman who had ever sung to a child in times of terror. They were with her in that room, an invisible choir echoing across time and borders. She imagined women in other villages, other countries, other wars, rocking their children and singing into the noise. Their voices overlapped with hers, threads weaving into a tapestry stronger than steel. Generals wrote history in blood, But women wrote survival in lullabies. She felt the truth of that in her bones. The world was still alive because mothers refused to stop singing. Her lullabies did not erase the cannons, but they transformed them. Where before each blast was only terror, now it became part of the rhythm she fought to control. She sang between the thunder, letting her voice rise in the gaps, daring to fill the spaces war tried to consume. The cradle rocked, her voice rose, and for a moment the cannons seemed smaller. The words themselves carried symbols. They spoke of rivers flowing freely, of stars that guided travelers home, of fields that would bloom again after winter. Each line was a promise disguised as a melody. She did not know if her child understood the meaning, but she knew he felt the weight of the song. The cradle rocked, not just with her hands, but with her voice, each note pushing it gently forward, each breath pulling it back. Hours passed, measured not by clocks, but by songs. She repeated the melody again and again, weaving it so deeply into the night that it became indistinguishable from the air. Her throat burned, her body ached, but she did not stop. To stop singing would be to surrender the fragile space she had created between them and the war. When dawn finally crept into the room, pale and cautious, she was hoarse, her voice reduced to a whisper. But the child slept, peaceful, untouched by the storm outside. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. She had covered the noise of war with nothing but breath and memory. She had proven that a song, fragile as it was, could stand against cannons. She realized then that lullabies were not only for children, they were for mothers too, for the singers themselves. Each note reminded her she was more than a survivor. She was a guardian of memory, of tenderness, of life itself. She had sung not only to soothe her child, but to keep her own heart from breaking. The song had carried her through the night as much as it had carried him. Years later, long after the cannons had gone silent and the village had been rebuilt, she still sang the lullaby. Her voice trembled with age, but the melody was unchanged. She sang it to her grandchildren, who giggled and nestled into her arms, unaware of the weight it once carried. She never told them that the song had once been a shield against war. She let them think it was only a lullaby because that was enough. But in her heart, she knew the truth. That night, her song had outlived the cannons. She told her daughters quietly, when they were old enough to understand, "Sing, even when you think no one can hear. Sing, even when your voice shakes. Because songs carry roads through ruins. Songs are maps no fire can erase." They nodded, not yet fully grasping, but she knew the knowledge had been planted in them, ready to bloom when needed. The generals had never known the sound of her lullaby. They never heard how it rose against their fire, how it steadied a child's sleep, how it kept hope alive. They thought victory was written in explosions. They never understood that victory was written in whispers, in rocking cradles, in lullabies that outlasted their noise. That night, she discovered her truest power. It was not strength of arms or strategy of mind. It was the courage to sing when silence seemed safer. It was the courage to let her voice rise when the world tried to drown it. It was the courage to weave hope into melody, knowing it might be the only thing that endured. Her lullabies had covered the noise of war, and in doing so, they had proved that love could sing louder than cannons. The wood that remembered touched more than flames. The cradle was older than the war. It was older than the sound of cannons, older than the silence of fear, older even than the hands that now rocked it every night. Its wood carried memories in its grain, traces of lives once held within it, echoes of lullabies long faded. To others it might have looked like a simple piece of furniture, plain, worn, scarred by time. But to her it was something more, a vessel of continuity, a quiet witness to generations, a map of memory carved not by fire, but by touch. When the first shell struck close enough to rattle the house, she thought the cradle might splinter. She rushed to steady it, pressing her palms against the sides, whispering comfort not only to the child inside, but to the wood itself. She had always believed that objects held memory, that they absorbed the essence of those who touched them. The cradle had absorbed laughter, tears, prayers, and hopes across decades. She would not let flames erase that. The war burned paper maps easily. It consumed documents, homes, photographs, even names etched in records. But wood was different. Wood remembered in silence, holding warmth even in cold rooms, giving back steadiness when hands trembled. She ran her fingers along the cradle's edge, tracing grooves worn smooth by her mother's touch, and knew that no cannon could erase what lived there. There were nights when she thought the house might collapse. Flames lit the horizon, ash drifted through the air, and the smell of smoke clung to her hair. Yet the cradle endured. Its wood creaked but did not break. The rocking motion was steady, rhythmic, stronger than the trembling earth. She realized that the cradle had survived more than one war. It had been rocked by hands before hers in times of hunger and fear, and it would be rocked again in times she could not yet imagine. Its endurance was not an accident. It was a choice made by every woman who refused to let it burn. She remembered stories her grandmother had told her, of carrying the cradle out of a burning house, of hiding it under blankets when soldiers looted villages, of protecting it as fiercely as she would protect a child. It was not just wood, it was memory carved into matter. And now, as cannons shook the earth, she joined that lineage of guardianship. Sometimes, when her child slept deeply, she laid her head against the cradle's side, listening. The wood seemed to hum, faintly, as though storing the vibrations of every lullaby ever sung. She imagined those songs layered on top of one another, centuries of voices overlapping, a chorus of survival. Each creak of the wood was like a heartbeat, reminding her that life continued, that touch outlasted fire. The generals believed destruction was permanent, that fire left nothing behind. But she knew otherwise. Fire destroyed surface, but not essence. The wood carried scars, burn marks, scratches, faded varnish. But these did not erase its memory, they deepened it. Just as her own scars marked survival, the cradle's scars marked endurance. Together, they embodied the truth. Flames can wound, but they cannot erase. She often thought of how fragile the cradle looked. Thin slats, uneven legs, a frame that wobbled if pushed too hard. And yet it had carried child after child, rocking them through storms and wars. Its strength lay not in perfection, but in continuity. She took comfort in that. Her own body felt fragile, worn by hunger and fear, yet she, too, endured. Like the cradle, her strength was not in her surface, but in the memory she carried. One evening, a shell landed close enough to send sparks flying into her yard. For a moment she panicked, imagining the cradle catching fire. She rushed to cover it with her body, shielding it as though it were flesh and blood. The sparks died quickly, leaving only smoke. Her heart pounded as she clutched the wood, her tears soaking into its grain. "You will not burn," she whispered. "You will outlive this." In that moment she realized she was not only protecting the cradle, she was protecting the memory of every woman who had rocked it before her. The wood did not speak, but it remembered. She felt it each time her hand slid over its surface, each time her child calmed at its rhythm. Memory was not only in minds, it was in matter, in objects touched with love. The generals could not understand this. They could burn archives, destroy monuments, rewrite borders, but they could not touch the quiet endurance of wood, warmed by generations of hands. Years later, when peace returned and the house was repaired, the cradle still stood. Its scars remained, dark lines etched into its frame. Reminders of fire survived. She would trace them gently, teaching her children and grandchildren that objects, like people, carry memory. "This cradle," she told them, "remembers more than war. It remembers love stronger than flames. They would touch it too, running their small fingers over the rough spots, and she knew the memory would live in them as well. The cradle became more than furniture. It was a storyteller. It spoke without words, its creaks carrying echoes of nights survived, its scars bearing witness to endurance. She kept it not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. It was proof that touch outlasts destruction, that memory clings even when fire tries to erase. The wood remembered touch more than flames, and in that memory she found comfort. Because if wood could endure, so could she. If the cradle could survive war, so could the child it carried. And if touch could leave such lasting marks, then love, too, would outlive the cannons. She rocked hunger into sleep. Hunger arrived quietly at first, like an uninvited guest who lingers at the edge of the room, pretending not to intrude. The first days of rationing had seemed manageable. Half a loaf stretched longer, a pot of soup made thinner with water, a single potato shared among many. But war does not stop at half measures. It takes and takes until the stomach growls louder than the cannons outside, until even children learn the language of emptiness. Hunger settled into the house like a shadow that would not leave, curling at the edges of the cradle, whispering into the night. Her child cried not from bombs that shook the walls, but from the ache that gnawed within. At first she tried to hush him with words, murmurs of comfort, promises of bread tomorrow. But hunger is not fooled by language. Hunger is honest and merciless. She wept when she realized there was nothing left to give, not milk, not broth, not even crumbs. All she had were her arms and the rhythm of rocking, so she lifted him from the cradle, held his frail body against her chest, and began to sway. Back and forth. Back and forth. The movement was old, older than memory, a language of mothers that predated speech. Her arms ached, her back burned, but she rocked with a steady determination, as if motion itself could fill an empty stomach. She sang softly, though her throat was raw, weaving lullabies over the cries of want. Slowly, the child's sobs softened into hiccups, then sighs, then sleep. She had not fed him, but she had given him rest. She had not quieted his hunger, but she had carried him across its sharpest edge. She realized then that rocking was not just an act of comfort, it was an act of resistance. The generals could starve them, strip them of food, reduce them to bone and ache, but they could not stop her from rocking. They could not silence the cradle's rhythm, could not erase the defiance of a mother who dared to soothe when there was nothing left to give. Hunger demanded surrender, but her arms refused it. Night after night, she repeated this ritual. When the cupboard was bare, when her own stomach twisted with emptiness, she still rocked. She let her body's steadiness become nourishment. Her heartbeat a substitute for bread, her voice a substitute for milk. The cradle creaked softly beneath her, echoing the lull of waves on a shore. She imagined her child dreaming of abundance, of fields heavy with grain, of tables filled with fruit. If dreams could feed, then she would give him feasts every night. Her mother taught her tricks, boiling weeds to make bitter soup, saving potato skins to chew slowly, soaking stale crusts in water to soften them. These acts kept bodies alive, but they could not fill the hollow space left behind. Only rocking seemed to touch that void. Hunger is relentless, but even it must rest. And when it rested, she slipped her child into sleep, carrying him into a place where pain loosened its grip, if only for a little while. She began to notice how hunger changed the village. Neighbors grew thinner, quieter. Children no longer ran through the streets but dragged their feet, their laughter replaced by silence. Yet, behind closed doors, the same rhythm repeated. Cradles rocking, arms swaying, songs weaving comfort through walls. She imagined the whole village moving as one, mothers rocking hunger into sleep across the night, creating invisible roads of endurance. The cannons outside roared, but inside, lullabies wove stronger echoes. Once, her brother asked how she could stand to rock when her own body cried louder than the childess. She looked at him, her eyes hollow, and answered, "Because his hunger is not mine alone. If I can carry him through one night, then tomorrow will come." She did not add that tomorrow might not bring food. That truth was too heavy for him, but she clung to it herself, the promise of another day, another chance, another breath. There were nights when she collapsed, too weak to sing, too tired to move, and yet even then her hands reached instinctively for the cradle. Rocking became muscle memory, survival etched into bone. Her arms shook, but they moved, her eyes blurred, but they watched. Her heart ached, but it beat steadily against her child's cheek. Hunger could gnaw her body, but it could not consume her will. She remembered one evening when the child whimpered endlessly, unable to settle. She had nothing left to offer, no song strong enough, no rocking steady enough. Desperation clawed at her chest. She prayed aloud for the first time in months, her words cracked and desperate. "Take my hunger, give him rest. Take my weakness, give him strength." As she whispered, she realized the cradle was rocking more gently, as though guided by unseen hands. The child sighed and drifted into sleep. She closed her eyes, tears sliding silently, and knew she was not alone. Every woman who had ever rocked hunger into sleep stood with her in that moment, a chorus of unseen mothers across time. Hunger, she discovered, was both cruel and revealing. It stripped away illusions, reduced life to its barest essence, yet in doing so, it also revealed the strength hidden in simplicity. A hand rocking a cradle, a voice humming a lullaby, a heartbeat steady against a small body. These became nourishment when bread failed. These became proof that even in absence, love could endure. Years later, when the war ended and food returned to their tables, she never forgot those nights. Even with abundance before her, she saved scraps, folded bread carefully, whispered thanks for every meal. But more than that, she remembered the rhythm of rocking. She taught her daughters and granddaughters that hunger is not only emptiness, but also endurance. When you have nothing left, she told them, you still have your arms, and that is enough to carry a child across a night. The generals had believed hunger would break them. They thought empty stomachs would silence resistance, that starvation would make people surrender. But they had not seen her arms rocking through the night, her voice covering the cries, her cradle defying emptiness with rhythm. Hunger could weaken the body, but it could not erase the will to soothe, to comfort, to love. She rocked hunger into sleep, and in doing so, she proved that even in the deepest absence, life could still be carried forward. The cradle that carried more than one child. The cradle was built for one, but war never asked permission before demanding more. It had been carved generations before to hold a single infant, to rock one fragile life into sleep at a time. Yet, when war hollowed streets and silenced homes, the cradle carried more than it was ever meant to. It became a vessel not just for her child, but for others, for children left without mothers, for small bodies trembling under the shadow of hunger and loss. The first time another child was laid in the cradle, she hesitated. It was Marta's baby, wrapped in thin cloth, skin pale from fever. Marta herself had grown too weak to rock him. Her hands trembled, her eyes burned with despair. She placed him gently beside her own child, whispering apologies for asking so much. At first she feared the cradle would protest, that the old wood would creak in refusal, that her own child would cry at the intrusion. But instead, the cradle held them both, side by side, their breathing uneven but alive, their small fists opening and closing as if searching for comfort. That night she rocked harder than she ever had, her arms aching, her back screaming with fatigue. The weight was heavier, the cries louder, the responsibility doubled. And yet, as dawn came and both children slept, she realized something profound. The cradle was not weakened by carrying more. It was strengthened. Its wood seemed to steady itself, its rhythm more resolute, as if it understood its new purpose. The cradle was no longer just for her child, it was for every child who needed it. Soon others followed. A neighbor knocked with a bundle too small for words. A widow placed her daughter in the cradle for a single night while she searched for food. Sometimes the cradle held 3 children at once, bodies pressed against each other like birds in a nest, their breaths rising and falling in uneven harmony. The cradle creaked under the weight, but it never broke. It accepted them all, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. She discovered that love, like wood, stretches further than anyone expects. At first she worried she would not have enough song, enough rocking, enough arms to comfort more than one. But each night she proved herself wrong. Her voice grew stronger, her rhythm steadier, her arms more enduring. She learned that the act of rocking was not divided by numbers, it multiplied. Each child added did not diminish her love, but expanded it, forcing her heart to grow beyond its limits. The cradle became a symbol in the village. Mothers whispered of it, of how it had rocked more children than any one woman could count. They came not only for their baby's rest, but for their own. To see the cradle still standing, still moving, was to believe that survival was possible. Even soldiers passing through noticed it, though they never understood. To them, it was just wood. They did not see the invisible weight it carried, the history woven into every creak. One night, when the air was thick with smoke and despair, she sat beside the cradle watching 3 children sleep. Their faces were turned toward one another, their small hands intertwined as if instinctively seeking connection. She realized that war had taken so much, food, safety, homes, but it had also forced a new kind of kinship. These children, unrelated by blood, had become siblings in survival. The cradle had carried them into a shared future, one bound not by lineage, but by endurance. She began to understand the cradle as a teacher. It whispered that no one survives alone, that strength multiplies when shared. Its creaks reminded her that capacity is greater than appearances, that fragility can hold more than expected. She saw herself in its endurance. She too had been built for one life, her own, yet here she was, carrying many. The cradle reflected her resilience back to her, showing her that she was more than she believed. There were moments of failure, nights when one child cried endlessly while another shivered with fever, when exhaustion made her weep silently as she rocked. She feared she was not enough, that she would drop them all into the abyss of war. But morning always came. The children always woke, fragile but alive, and each sunrise proved the cradle right. It could hold more than it was meant to. She could too. Years later, when the war was over and peace returned like a hesitant guest, she still kept the cradle. By then it bore marks of every child it had held, scratches from restless feet, stains from tears and sickness, grooves deepened by relentless rocking. She refused to polish or repair it. Those marks were history, memory carved into wood. They told the truth, that survival is never solitary, that lives are interwoven, that the cradle of tomorrow must always be big enough to carry more than one. Her children grew, but she never let them forget. She told them, "This cradle carried you, but it carried others too. Your lives are bound together. Never believe you walk alone." They listened, sometimes dismissive, but she knew the truth had been planted. It would grow in them when their time came to carry others. The generals had burned villages, stolen food, silenced voices. But they had not broken the cradle. They had not broken the invisible law it carried, that in times of destruction, survival is shared. They had not broken her arms, which rocked not only her child, but every child brought to her. They had not broken the truth that love, like wood, stretches further than anyone believes. The cradle had carried more than one child. It had carried hope itself. And in that truth, she found her own survival. Her hands became the pillars of tomorrow. Her hands had never been remarkable before the war. They were small, roughened only by ordinary tasks, kneading bread, sewing buttons, braiding her sister's hair. They were the hands of a woman who lived simply, whose future once promised days of tending gardens, baking loaves, washing linen by the river. But war does not let hands remain ordinary. It calls them into service, reshaping them into something new. Over time, her hands became more than tools. They became pillars, pillars strong enough to hold a collapsing world, steady enough to carry the fragile weight of tomorrow. The first transformation happened without her noticing. Rocking the cradle seemed like a small act, a reflex born of instinct. But night after night, as bombs shook the windows and hunger hollowed their stomachs, she began to see the rhythm differently. Her hands never faltered, even when the rest of her body trembled. They moved with a certainty that her voice could not find, with a steadiness her heart envied. When despair pressed against her chest like a stone, her hands continued rocking. They held her child in the rhythm of survival, refusing to let fear dictate the future. Soon her hands took on more burdens. They dug shallow gardens in soil too thin to yield, planting scraps of potato and dried beans in the hope that something, anything, might grow. They washed the fever from her brother's skin, cooled his forehead with damp cloths wrung from water she had carried for miles. They stitched fabric into makeshift clothes, tore strips to bind wounds, pressed dough from the last of their flour into bread so thin it was more memory than nourishment. With every act, her hands said what her lips could not. "We will endure." Others noticed too. Neighbors began to look at her differently. Not because she was stronger than they were, but because her hands never seemed to stop. When Marta's fever kept her bedridden, it was those hands that rocked her child as well as her own. When Sophia wept over a torn coat, it was those hands that mended it with clumsy but determined stitches. When a stranger collapsed in the street, it was those hands that lifted him, carried him to water, coaxed life back into his lungs. She never asked for recognition, but people whispered quietly, "Her hands are stronger than the cannons." There were nights when even she doubted. She would stare at her palms, cracked and bleeding, and wonder how long they could go on. The skin split from endless scrubbing, the nails torn from carrying wood, the joints swollen from cold. But when she looked at her child asleep in the cradle, she understood. Her hands were no longer just flesh and bone. They were pillars, holding up not only her own life, but the fragile architecture of the future. The weight of tomorrow was heavy. It was heavier than bombs, heavier than hunger, heavier than grief. Tomorrow demanded that she endure so her child could see another dawn. Tomorrow asked her to carry hope through nights when there was none. Tomorrow whispered that the lullabies, the rocking, the small acts of survival mattered more than victories written in blood. Her hands became the answer to that demand. They bore the weight silently, lifting, stitching, planting, holding, always holding. She discovered something remarkable. Hands could carry memory too. She remembered her mother's hands smoothing her hair, her grandmother's hands kneading dough, her neighbor's hands passing her bread in silence. When she worked, she felt those other hands guiding her, as though each touch had been passed down like an inheritance. Her hands were not hers alone. They were the accumulation of every woman who had come before her, every survivor who had kept life moving when the world tried to stop it. One winter night, when the cold cut through the house like a blade, she pressed her hands around her child's body to warm him. They shook violently, aching with frost, but they did not let go. She thought then of pillars holding up a crumbling roof, refusing to collapse even under impossible weight. She whispered through chattering teeth, "You will survive, because my hands will not fail you." The child slept, his small breath steady against her skin. She knew in that moment that her hands had become something sacred. Years later, when the war ended and rebuilding began, her hands did not rest. They carried stones to lay new foundations, planted seeds in soil, finally free from ash, washed her children in clear water without fear of bombs interrupting. Yet even in peace, The memory of what her hands had done never left her. She could still feel the weight of every night they had carried, the rhythm of every lullaby they had woven into the air, the scars etched deep into their skin. She looked at them often, not with shame but with reverence. They were not delicate, but they were holy. She taught her daughters the truth of them. "These hands," she said, holding them out, palms scarred and fingers crooked, "are not beautiful, but they built tomorrow. Remember that beauty is not what the world sees, it is what endures." They listened, tracing the lines of her skin with awe, learning to see strength where others saw only roughness. Her grandchildren would later climb into her lap, grabbing her fingers playfully, unaware of the history written in those hands. She smiled at their innocence, grateful that they would never need to know the weight her hands had carried. Yet silently, she hoped they would carry the lesson that love and resilience are strongest when they are lived through hands. The generals had built cannons with their hands, weapons meant to destroy. But she had built tomorrow with hers. The difference was eternal. Cannons silenced themselves when war ended, rusting in forgotten fields. Her hands, however, lived on in every child she rocked, every neighbor she helped, every seed she planted. They became monuments without stone, remembered not for destruction, but for endurance. Her hands had become the pillars of tomorrow, and in that truth she found peace. The songs that traveled beyond ruins. Songs are strange things. They have no weight, no body, no form. They cannot be touched or held, cannot be locked away or destroyed by fire. And yet they endure longer than stone, longer than weapons, longer even than memory written on paper. When words fail and silence presses too hard, songs rise. They flow where feet cannot walk. They cross borders without passports. They slip through cracks in walls and drift over ruins like invisible wings. She discovered this truth on nights when the world seemed to collapse, when rubble filled the streets and the cannons shook the ground. It was then that her songs traveled beyond the ruins, carrying life farther than she could ever walk. The first time she realized her lullabies were traveling was almost by accident. She was rocking the cradle, her voice hoarse from days of hunger, when she noticed the neighbor's child listening through the thin wall. His eyes were wide, his small body trembling from fear. She had not meant to sing for him, but her voice reached him anyway. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes as though her song had wrapped around him like a blanket. That night, 2 children slept because of one song. After that, she sang louder. Not in defiance, not in pride, but in recognition that her voice was needed beyond her own home. The walls of her house were thin, and so were the walls of every house nearby. Her voice slipped through cracks, carried itself into rooms she could not enter, soothed children she could not hold. She did not know it then, but her songs became bridges across ruins, uniting neighbors in a shared rhythm of survival. One night, when the bombs fell closer than ever, she paused, certain her voice was too small against the thunder, but then, faintly, she heard something miraculous. Another woman, across the street, had begun to sing too. Different words, different melody, but the same intent, to carry children through the night. Their voices overlapped, weaving together like threads of the same cloth. Soon another voice joined, then another, until the street itself seemed to hum. Songs rose above the ruins, fragile yet unbreakable. The cannons screamed, but the lullabies did not stop. She realized then that songs are not bound by walls. They move where they are needed, finding ears that ache for comfort, finding hearts that ache for hope. They are invisible messengers, carrying tenderness across landscapes torn apart. And because they are invisible, no general can burn them. No soldier can silence them. Songs slip past checkpoints and bayonets, traveling farther than fear. Her child grew to recognize the difference between the sounds of war and the sounds of love. He learned to fall asleep, not in silence. It no longer existed, but in song. Each note became a landmark for him, a road through darkness, proof that his mother was near. Sometimes she would stop singing just to see his reaction. Immediately his body stirred, restless. Only when her voice returned did he settle again. For him, the world's stability was measured in lullabies. She began to notice how her own body responded too. Singing steadied her heartbeat, slowed her breathing, softened the sharp edges of fear. It reminded her that she was alive, not merely surviving. The songs became her own form of prayer, not directed upward but outward, into the ruins, into the world that needed healing. Each note was a declaration. We are still here. There was one particular song her grandmother had taught her, a melody so old no one remembered its origin. The words spoke of rivers that carried voices, of fields that returned after winter, of stars that never abandoned the night. She sang it often, and over time she realized others were singing it too. A woman in the cellar hummed the same tune. A child in the street whistled fragments of it while playing among rubble. The song had left her lips and traveled on its own, carried by those who needed it. It had become part of the collective memory of survival. Once, after weeks of silence between neighbors, silence born of exhaustion, fear, grief, she heard a man humming the lullaby as he repaired a broken door. It startled her, hearing her grandmother's melody in another's voice. She realized then that songs outlive ownership. They belong to no one and everyone, passed along like water in cupped hands, keeping thirst at bay. The ruins themselves seemed to absorb the music. She swore sometimes that the stones hummed after she stopped singing, as if holding on to the notes for a moment longer. Perhaps it was only her imagination, but she believed it. After all, if wood could remember touch, why couldn't ruins remember song? Every creak of rubble, every echo in broken walls, felt like proof that songs linger, even when voices fall silent. Years later, when peace returned and the village rebuilt itself from ashes, she still sang. The songs had changed, softened, but they carried the same truth. Children who had been rocked to sleep by lullabies of survival grew up hearing those same tunes in kitchens and fields, unaware of their origin. They thought of them as ordinary songs, folk melodies without history. But she knew each note carried ruins inside it, each rhythm carried nights of terror survived. Her grandchildren once asked why she always sang while working. She smiled but did not explain. How could she tell them that her songs had once been the only barrier between life and despair? How could she explain that melodies had traveled beyond rubble, weaving invisible threads that kept people alive? She simply told them songs make work lighter. And they laughed, imitating her tunes, carrying them forward without knowing the weight they bore. The generals had burned libraries, destroyed monuments, silenced voices. But they could not stop songs. Songs slipped past fire, past silence, past fear. They traveled into places no weapon could reach. They carried tenderness across ruins and planted hope where no soil remained. She understood then that survival was never only about food or shelter. It was also about song, about finding a voice when the world demanded silence, about carrying melody through rubble so that children could dream of stars instead of bombs. Her lullabies had traveled farther than any army, and they continued to travel long after the cannons had quieted. The songs that traveled beyond ruins became part of her legacy. They were not written down, but they were remembered. They lived in the air, in the hearts of those who had heard them, in the generations that came after, and in that way, they proved stronger than war. The cradle that refused to break. The cradle had always been fragile to the eyes of others. Its wood was chipped, its legs uneven, its frame worn thin from generations of use. Neighbors sometimes looked at it and shook their heads, whispering that it was too old, too frail, that surely one more winter or one more child would finish it. But war is full of ironies, and while cannons shattered stone walls and bombs tore down iron gates, the cradle endured. It rocked through fire, through hunger, through sleepless nights. No matter how hard the world shook, it refused to break. She often wondered why. It wasn't built of the strongest wood. It had no ornate carvings, no clever design. And yet each time her hands pressed against its sides, it seemed to gather strength from somewhere unseen. Perhaps it was memory, every mother who had touched it before her, every child who had slept in its arms, leaving traces of themselves in its grain. Perhaps it was love, seeping into the wood with every lullaby, with every tear, with every whispered prayer. Whatever the reason, the cradle carried more endurance than anyone expected. One night, when bombs fell so close the floor split in cracks beneath her feet, she thought the cradle would collapse. The ceiling groaned, dust filled the air, and the house seemed to sway. She threw herself over the cradle, covering it with her body as if it were made of glass. But when the earth grew still, she found the wood unbroken. It rocked gently under her arms, creaking but steady, as if to say, "I am still here. So are you." She kissed its edge through tears, whispering, "You are stronger than me." But she knew the truth. The cradle's strength and hers were one and the same. Children came and went through that cradle, some her own, some from neighbors too weak to rock theirs, some who stayed only for a night, wrapped in thin cloth, finding a moment of rest. The cradle bore them all without complaint. Its sides bore scratches from restless hands, its surface stained by illness, its joints loosened by constant rocking. Yet it never gave way. Each mark was not a wound, but a testimony, proof that even under strain, even under endless weight, it endured. She began to see the cradle as a mirror of herself. Both looked fragile, both carried more than they were built for. Both were scarred, marked, weary, and yet both continued. People underestimated them, thought they would collapse, thought they could not last another night. But night after night they proved otherwise. She realized that endurance is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is as quiet as wood that does not splinter, as steady as a rhythm that does not falter. There were times she wished for a stronger cradle, one newer, one made of harder wood. But as months turned into years, she grew grateful for the old one. Its creaks were familiar, its imperfections beloved. Each sound reminded her that it had survived, that it refused to break no matter how the world tried. She began to believe that its endurance was not just material, it was symbolic. The cradle was telling her, "If I can hold on, so can you." One winter morning, after a night of endless cannon fire, she carried the cradle outside to breathe the pale sunlight. Around her, ruins stretched in every direction. Houses collapsed into piles of stone, fences broken, roofs missing. And yet in the middle of it all stood the cradle, rocking gently in the wind. Passers-by stopped to look, some smiling through tears, others shaking their heads in wonder. "How has it not broken?" someone asked. She had no answer, except to place her hand on the wood and whisper, "Because it was never meant to." She began to understand that breaking and enduring are not opposites. To endure is not to remain untouched. It is to carry scars, to creak, to bend, and still remain standing. The cradle had endured not by resisting damage, but by absorbing it, by transforming weakness into history. She felt the same in herself. She too was scarred, weary, creaking inside, but she too refused to break. When peace finally came, and the village was rebuilt, she could have set the cradle aside. She could have bought a new one, smoother, shinier, unmarked by war. But she refused. The old cradle remained in her home, its scars unpolished, its wood still creaking. To her it was not just furniture but memory incarnate, proof that survival was possible. Whenever she touched it, she felt the rhythm of all the nights it had carried her through, all the lives it had cradled, all the storms it had endured. Her children grew, but they remembered the cradle too. They would sit by it, tracing the marks, asking her to tell the stories. She would smile, stroke the wood and say, "This cradle refused to break when everything else did. And that is why you are here." They listened with awe, learning that endurance lives not in strength alone, but in refusal. Refusal to collapse, refusal to surrender, refusal to let war define the end. The generals had thought destruction was absolute. They had thought fire could consume everything, that bombs could erase even memory. But they had not counted on a cradle. They had not counted on wood that carried love in its grain, on mothers who rocked through the night, on endurance that outlasted violence. They could break stone, but they could not break this. The cradle that refused to break became a symbol, not only for her, but for all who knew it. It was proof that fragility can be stronger than force, that endurance can be carved from love, that survival is written not in victories, but in small, steady acts. She looked at it often, tears in her eyes, and thought, as long as this cradle stands, tomorrow will come. Her silence rocked more deeply than words. There are moments when words become useless, when language itself collapses under the weight of suffering. During the war, she discovered that silence could hold more than sentences, could carry more comfort than speeches, could rock her child more deeply than any story she could tell. At first, she fought against that truth. She wanted to speak, to reassure, to explain. But the world outside had become a chaos of shouts and explosions, orders barked in anger, cries of the wounded echoing in the night. Words had been corrupted by war. Silence, however, remained hers, and so she learned to rock not only with her hands, but with her silence. When her child cried from hunger, she whispered promises. Tomorrow, food will come. Tomorrow you will eat your fill. But promises became lies when tomorrow brought nothing. She stopped speaking them, realizing that false words wounded more than empty air. Instead, she gathered him into her arms, pressed him against her chest, and let her silence speak. The rhythm of her heartbeat was truer than any promise. It told him, "I am here. You are not alone." That unspoken message soothed him more than words ever could. Her silence became a language of its own. When she placed her hand on the cradle without speaking, her child understood safety. When she rocked without humming, he still felt the lull of care. The absence of sound became presence. It was as if her silence created a shield, a cocoon wrapping around them both, separating them from the noise outside. She realized then that silence was not emptiness. It was fullness, heavy with meaning, steady with love. The neighbors noticed too. Sometimes they gathered in her home when the bombs grew too close. People sat in cramped corners, children pressed against their mothers, adults staring at the floor. At first, there was always nervous chatter, questions no one could answer, fears spoken aloud only to grow larger. But then they would hear the creak of the cradle, see her rocking in silence, and one by one the voices would fall away. The room would grow still, not with despair, but with reverence. Her silence calmed them, anchored them. It was stronger than words. There was one night when soldiers marched through the village, their boots echoing like thunder. Her child stirred, frightened, and she almost began to sing. But instinct stopped her. Instead, she rocked in silence, her body motionless except for the steady rhythm of her hands. Her child pressed his face into her chest, listening not to words, but to the quiet strength in her stillness. Soldiers shouted outside, but inside there was only silence, deep and unyielding. That silence protected them more effectively than any wall. She discovered that silence could also carry memory. Words fade, but silence lingers, etching itself into the body. She remembered her mother's silences, how she never spoke of certain losses, how her pauses between sentences spoke louder than explanations. She realized now that those silences had been maps, guiding her toward truths too heavy for words. Her own silence became a similar map for her child. He would grow up not remembering what she had said, but what she had not. And in that space, he would carry lessons of endurance, compassion, restraint. Silence was also her resistance. The generals wanted people to repeat their slogans, to parrot their lies, to shout their victories. She refused. She answered with silence, preserving dignity in a world that demanded submission. Neighbors sometimes worried that her quiet meant despair, but they were wrong. It meant defiance. It meant she would not let war dictate her voice. Her silence was hers alone, untouched by propaganda, unbroken by fear. There were moments when silence was unbearable, when she longed to scream, to release the grief bottled inside her. She bit her lip until it bled, swallowed sobs that threatened to shake the cradle. And yet, even then, she chose silence, not because she was strong, but because she knew her screams would frighten her child more than soothe him. She carried that weight in her chest, letting it burn, transforming it into steady rocking. Her silence was sacrifice. Years later, her child, grown into a man, asked her what she remembered most from those nights. She answered not with a story, but with a pause, a long silence that filled the room. He understood. He felt the depth of that quiet, the weight of everything she had chosen not to say. Tears filled his eyes, because he realized then that silence can be louder than war. Her grandchildren sometimes laughed at her habit of sitting quietly, staring out windows without speaking. They did not know that in those silences, she was rocking them still, carrying them in her memory, soothing fears they did not yet have. She did not explain. She simply let the silence work, trusting it to teach them as it had taught her. The generals had used words as weapons, twisting them into lies, shouting them across nations. But they had not understood silence. They had not known that silence could resist, could comfort, could endure. They thought silence meant defeat. They were wrong. In her cradle, silence meant survival. Her silence rocked more deeply than words, and in that truth she found strength beyond measure. The night the cannons paused, but the cradle did not. The war had its rhythm, as strange as that sounded. Days of thunder, nights of fire, mornings of ash. Weeks when the earth never seemed still, when bombs wrote their language into the soil. And then, unexpectedly, there were pauses. Ceasefires that lasted hours, sometimes days. Nights when the cannons held their tongues, as if exhausted by their own destruction. These rare silences unsettled her as much as the noise, because peace, even temporary, felt unfamiliar. It was during one such night when the cannons paused that she realized the cradle never did. The evening began with the usual tremors, distant booms, windows rattling, dust falling from beams overhead. She braced herself for another endless night. But as darkness deepened, the explosions faded. The sky grew strangely still. For the first time in months, no orange glow lit the horizon. The air was not thick with smoke. It should have been a relief, but instead, it filled her with unease. Silence, when it came, felt too sharp, too fragile, like glass that could shatter at any breath. Her child stirred in the cradle, not from fear, but from habit. He had grown so used to sleeping through noise that the absence of it startled him. His eyes fluttered open, confused. She leaned forward, brushing his cheek with her finger, and began to rock, back and forth, back and forth. The creak of the wood was the only sound in the room. Outside, the night waited, unnervingly empty. Inside, the cradle sang its quiet rhythm. She hummed softly, though even that felt unnecessary. The world outside was quiet enough to hear her own breathing, her own heartbeat. Yet she sang anyway because silence without song felt too wide, too heavy. Her voice, low and steady, wrapped around the child like the walls of a home no bomb could touch. He blinked, then drifted back into sleep, his small chest rising and falling in perfect trust. The hours crept by slowly. She expected at any moment to hear the roar return, to feel the ground tremble, to see the sky split again. But the night remained still. For the first time in so long, she could hear the wind brushing against the broken shutters, the faint call of an owl in the distance, the whisper of leaves stirring in the dark. It felt unreal, like a memory from another life. She realized how much she had forgotten the sound of peace, yet the cradle did not pause. Its rhythm continued, faithful and eternal. She thought of all the nights it had endured through fire and fear, and marveled at how it rocked the same way now, in silence. The cradle knew nothing of cannons. It knew only the language of hands, of weight, of love. War could not touch that. She pressed her hand to the wood, feeling its familiar vibration, and thought, "You have been constant when nothing else has. You do not pause when the world does. You carry on, and so do I." As the hours passed, she grew aware of something deeper. The cradle was not simply rocking her child, it was rocking her too. The steady rhythm calmed her more than silence ever could. It gave her something to hold on to, something unbroken. She realized she had grown afraid of peace, afraid of what came after noise, but the cradle reminded her that continuity mattered more than interruption. Even if the cannons stopped forever, the rocking would remain. That thought steadied her heart. Toward dawn, she stepped outside, carrying the cradle with her. The air was crisp, untainted by smoke. The village lay in ruins, but the sky above was clear for the first time in months. Stars glittered faintly, refusing to hide. She set the cradle on the ground and rocked it under the open sky, tears slipping down her cheeks. The child slept soundly, untroubled, as though sensing that for this one night the earth had remembered mercy. She thought then of all the mothers across the land. How many of them were rocking still, even in silence? How many cradles continued their rhythm when the cannons paused? She imagined thousands of hands moving together, unseen, creating a rhythm that tied the world together. The thought filled her with awe. The war was loud, but mothers were constant. Cannons paused, cradles did not. When the first rays of sun broke the horizon, she whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the silence, but for the rhythm that had carried her through. She knew the cannons would roar again. She knew the pause would end, but she also knew that the cradle would not betray her. Its constancy was greater than war's unpredictability. That truth became her anchor. Years later, when she told her children about that night, she did not describe the silence of the cannons. She described the sound of the cradle creaking in the dark, steady and unwavering. That, she told them, is the sound that saved us, not the pause of war, but the persistence of love. The generals believed power lived in explosions, in the ability to pause or resume violence at will. But she had learned otherwise. True power lived in the unbroken rhythm of care, in the refusal to pause when life demanded constancy. Cannons stopped, cradles endured. And in that endurance, tomorrow was born. The night the cannons paused, but the cradle did not become a memory she carried forever. It reminded her that survival is not only about enduring chaos, but also about continuing in stillness. When destruction hesitated, love did not. When war rested, care carried on. The cradle taught her that even in peace, the rhythm of rocking must continue, because tomorrow always depends on it. The cradle that knew more names than graves. The war carved names into stone, with a cruelty that seemed endless. Every week the village whispered of another man gone, another child lost, another woman buried in silence. Graves multiplied faster than harvests, markers standing crooked in soil that had grown too accustomed to sorrow. Yet inside her home, in that small corner where the cradle stood, another truth lived. The cradle knew more names than graves, and unlike stone, it did not remember death, it remembered life. Each child who lay within it was not anonymous. They had names whispered against fevered foreheads, names sung in lullabies, names spoken softly as the wood creaked beneath their bodies. Some names belonged to her own children, others to the children of neighbors, still others to the orphans left behind by war's relentless hunger. The cradle held them all, carrying each name like a sacred trust. It knew them not as statistics or losses, but as breaths, as tiny fists, as dreams waiting in fragile bodies. She sometimes pressed her cheek against the wood and whispered those names one by one, as though the cradle could keep them safer than her memory alone. Luca, she murmured, Anna, David, Sophia, Thomas. The list grew longer as the months bled into years. Yet unlike the cemetery on the hill, where names were carved into cold stone, the cradle carried names in warmth, in motion, in touch. Every time it rocked, it spoke those names silently, promising continuity. There were nights when a child slept in the cradle only once before being taken by illness or by war. Those names haunted her most, but still she rocked, believing that even a single night of comfort mattered. The cradle remembered those children too, their small weights leaving impressions in its wood, their names etched invisibly into its rhythm. When she touched its surface, she swore she could feel them, ghosts of warmth, faint echoes of sighs. They were gone from the world, but they lived in the cradle's memory. Her neighbors began to notice. They would bring their children not just for rest, but for remembrance. "Let the cradle hold him tonight," one mother said through tears. "So it will remember his name, even if the world forgets." And so the cradle became more than a bed. It became a keeper of memory, a book written not in ink, but in touch. Every child who lay within it added a page, and every name whispered became part of its story. She marveled at how the cradle carried more names than the graveyard. The war wanted to erase, to reduce lives to losses, to count only the dead. But the cradle insisted on counting the living, even if their lives were brief. It insisted that names mattered, that children were more than numbers. It kept them alive, if not in body, then in memory, rocking them into eternity. One evening, when the sky burned red with fire and smoke, she sat by the cradle and whispered aloud, "You know more than I do. You remember more than I can." Her hands shook as she rocked, her tears falling on the wood. She imagined the cradle answering back, not with words, but with creaks, reminding her, "Yes, I carry them. Yes, I will keep them safe. Yes, their names will not be lost." The thought comforted her in ways she could not explain. For even if she died, the cradle would remain, still carrying the weight of those names, still holding their memory. And perhaps one day, when peace returned, someone else would hear those names in its creaks, would feel them in its touch. Years later, when the war ended and the graveyard overflowed, she visited it less often than others expected. Instead, she stayed by the cradle. Her neighbors did not understand at first. They thought she avoided grief, but she knew differently. The graveyard told stories of endings, the cradle told stories of continuities. She chose to dwell in the place where names lived, not where they were buried. Her children grew up hearing her whisper names to the cradle, even names they did not recognize. When they asked, she only said, "These are the names of tomorrow." They thought it poetic nonsense, but in time they understood. The cradle was not only theirs. It belonged to every child it had ever carried, every name it had ever heard. In its memory, tomorrow was preserved. The generals carved their victories into monuments, raising statues that towered over ruins. But she knew monuments crumble, statues fall. The cradle endured longer than stone, because it was made not of marble, but of memory. It remembered in silence, in rhythm, in touch. And in that remembrance, it kept alive more names than graves ever could. The cradle that knew more names than graves became her greatest comfort, because as long as it rocked, as long as it carried children, The war had not won. Names lived, lives continued. Tomorrow was possible. Her arms became the strongest walls. The war had reduced walls to rubble. Houses once proud and solid now stood as skeletons, beams exposed, stones scattered. Churches, schools, barns, all cracked open like eggs, their insides spilled into the streets. Families huddled behind whatever fragments remained, hoping that half a wall or a leaning doorway would shield them. But she learned quickly that no wall was strong enough to withstand the hunger of fire or the claws of shells, and so she built her own fortress, not of stone, not of wood, but of flesh and love. Her arms became the strongest walls. It began instinctively. The first time the roof shook under the impact of bombs, dust rained down onto the cradle, and she threw herself over it, wrapping her arms around her child. She expected to feel the world crash through her body, to be torn apart by the violence outside, but instead she felt something else: resolve. Her arms would not yield. Her body would break before they let go. That night she realized the walls of her home might fall, but as long as her arms were around her child, he would know safety. From then on, her embrace became his shelter. When the cold seeped through broken windows, she wrapped him close, her own body heat serving as fire. When hunger gnawed, she pressed him against her chest so he could hear her heart, reminding him that life still pulsed. When soldiers marched outside and boots pounded like drums of fear, she pulled him into her arms, silence surrounding them like stone. He never asked for explanations. He only needed the certainty of her hold. The cradle still rocked, but often she lifted him into her arms and became the cradle herself. Back and forth, her body swaying, her muscles aching, but her will unshaken. Neighbors sometimes whispered, "You'll exhaust yourself, put him down." But they didn't understand. Stone walls had fallen, wooden beams had snapped, only her arms had not. They were his last fortress, the last structure left unbroken. One night, Marta arrived with her infant, shivering and sick. Her own body was too weak to hold him. Without hesitation, she gathered both children into her arms, one on each side of her chest. Her shoulders screamed with pain, her legs trembled, but she stood like a wall, immovable. The children whimpered, then slowly quieted, soothed by the rhythm of her heartbeat and the shield of her embrace. Marta wept softly, whispering, "Your arms are stronger than any house." She did not answer, but she knew it was true. Over time, the village came to rely on her arms as much as on her cradle. In cellars filled with smoke, she gathered frightened children against her body, whispering nothing, only holding. In fields where ruins burned, she shielded the smallest with her own frame. She discovered that walls do not need to be tall or thick to be strong. They only need to be willing to break before what they protect breaks. That was her vow. There were nights when her strength faltered, when she thought her arms would finally give out. But each time she looked down at her child's face, at his trust so complete, something deeper than muscle carried her. She realized that arms fueled by love do not collapse. They may ache, they may tremble, they may scar, but they do not yield. Years later, when peace returned and homes were rebuilt with sturdy stone and shining windows, she would sometimes sit in her doorway, her child, now grown, resting against her shoulder. She would smile at the strong walls rising once more around her, but in her heart she knew none would ever match the strength of her arms. For those walls had held not only one life, but generations of tomorrow. Her grandchildren would run into her embrace, laughing, climbing over her, as if she were a fortress. They thought it was a game, unaware that once her arms had been the only walls between life and death. She never told them. She only held them tighter, letting them feel the safety she once carried through fire. The generals had toppled walls, burned houses, destroyed monuments, but they could not destroy her arms. They could not understand that flesh and love could be stronger than stone. They believed power was written in weapons. She knew power was written in embrace. Her arms had become the strongest walls, and within them the future had survived. The cradle that rocked nations unseen. History books would later be filled with the names of generals, the dates of battles, the treaties signed under chandeliers in distant palaces. They would map front lines, calculate losses, praise victories carved into soil by cannons and tanks. But no book would record the nights when a mother's hand rocked a cradle through fear. No page would capture the rhythm of wood creaking under weight, the soft sound of lullabies rising against thunder. And yet, it was that rhythm, the quiet persistence of care, that held nations together. The cradle she rocked did not only comfort one child, it rocked nations unseen. She did not think of it that way at first. To her, the cradle was a small world, a wooden vessel barely large enough for her child's fragile body. But as the war stretched on, she began to notice how far its ripples traveled. Each time her child woke, rested, he carried into the day a piece of calm that had been woven in the night. Each neighbor who entrusted their infant to her cradle found strength in the morning, knowing their children had been rocked safely through chaos. The rhythm expanded outward, touching more than she realized. She imagined the invisible roads the cradle created, roads of memory, roads of tenderness, roads of endurance. They reached across the village, connecting homes fractured by fear. They stretched beyond the village, joining with the unseen rocking of other mothers in other towns, in other lands, in wars before and wars yet to come. The generals thought they were shaping nations with fire and borders, but she knew better. Nations were held together by the invisible rhythm of cradles, rocking through nights no one recorded. One evening, when hunger bit hardest and despair thickened the air, a neighbor came to her door with empty hands. "I have nothing left," she whispered, her voice breaking, "not even hope." Without speaking, she guided the woman inside and pointed to the cradle. The neighbor laid her child down, and together they rocked. As the wood creaked, the woman's tears slowed. "It feels like the world is steady again," she murmured. And in that moment she understood. The cradle did not only steady children, it steadied mothers, it steadied entire communities. The cradle became a silent gathering point. People came not to see it, but to feel what it carried. In its presence, despair softened, replaced by something wordless but powerful. She began to believe the cradle had become more than an object. It was a vessel of continuity, a reminder that life persisted even when everything else crumbled. By holding one child, it was holding the possibility of tomorrow, and in tomorrow lay the future of nations. She thought of her grandmother's words, "Rocking a cradle is rocking the future." As a child, she had not understood. Now she did. Every motion, every lullaby, every touch of her hand against wood was not only survival for one night. It was the planting of seeds that would grow into generations. Her arms were shaping tomorrow, unseen but indelible. Sometimes she closed her eyes while rocking and imagined her child grown, walking through fields no longer scarred by war, speaking in a voice unbroken by fear. She imagined him raising his own children, telling them stories not of cannons, but of songs. She realized then that her rocking was writing history, not in ink, but in flesh and memory. Nations are not truly built in palaces, they are built in cradles. The thought gave her strength on nights when her arms shook with exhaustion. She told herself, "This is not just for now, this is for later. This is for tomorrow's world, the one my child will inherit." She felt her rocking extend outward, as though each push and pull steadied not only her home, but the fragile architecture of the future. Years later, when peace finally came, she saw the truth of it. Children who had slept in her cradle grew into adults who carried resilience in their bones. They became farmers who tilled fields again, teachers who rebuilt schools, healers who tended wounds. They carried with them the memory of nights when the cradle's rhythm had promised safety in a world of chaos. None of them spoke of it openly, but it was there, hidden in their endurance. Her own child, now grown, once asked her if she ever felt powerless during the war. She smiled softly, her hands resting on the old wood. "Powerless," she whispered. "No, I held the future in this cradle. I rocked nations without knowing." He laughed, thinking her words poetic, but deep down, he understood. His life and the lives of his generation had been carried forward not by cannons, but by cradles. The generals never knew. They believed their victories carved history, that their maps defined nations. But she knew nations are made not only of borders and treaties, but of children who survived nights of war. Each cradle that rocked was a fortress, each lullaby a foundation, each mother's hand a pillar. Together, unseen, they built the true architecture of nations. Her cradle had rocked nations unseen, and though no monument bore its name, its creak echoed longer than any cannon. Her lullabies became history's forgotten anthem. History remembers the anthems sung by armies, the marches that thundered across battlefields, the patriotic songs shouted under banners raised high. Those melodies are preserved in books, replayed in ceremonies, their words carved into the memory of nations. But the songs that truly carried the world forward were not shouted by soldiers. They were whispered in the dark, in kitchens, in cellars, in ruined homes. They were lullabies, her lullabies. And though they were never written down, never played by brass bands, never taught in schools, they became history's forgotten anthem. She began singing because there was nothing else left to give. Bread was gone, safety was gone, silence itself was gone. But her voice remained. At first it trembled, hoarse with fear, but night after night it grew steadier. She learned how to cover the noise of bombs with melody, how to stitch broken moments together with rhythm. Her lullabies were not grand or complex. They were fragments of old songs remembered from her grandmother, pieces of folk tunes reshaped by necessity, yet in their simplicity lay their power. Her child knew them better than he knew words of prayer or speech. He fell asleep not to silence, but to her voice, weaving protection into the air. He did not understand their meaning, but he understood their truth. You are safe because I am here. Tomorrow will come because I believe it will. Those truths sank deeper than language. They became part of his bones, part of his memory, long after the war ended. But it wasn't only her child who listened. Thin walls let her voice travel. Neighbors lying awake in terror would hear her lullabies drifting through the night. Some admitted later that they closed their eyes, pretending she sang for them too. They let her voice carry them across hours they thought they could not survive. Without realizing it, she had become more than a mother singing to her child. She had become a voice for the entire street, a fragile anchor against chaos. She once stopped singing, exhausted, her throat raw from days without water. The silence felt heavy, and she thought perhaps it did not matter if she sang or not. But then she heard it. Another woman's voice, across the rubble, picking up her melody, soft at first, then stronger. Soon another joined, and another, until the night hummed with lullabies. Different tunes, different words, but all carrying the same heartbeat. She wept silently, realizing her song had multiplied. It was no longer hers. It was theirs. She began to think of lullabies as threads woven into fabric too vast to see. Each night she added her fragile thread, believing it disappeared into nothing. But slowly she saw that the threads intertwined, forming a cloth strong enough to cover entire communities. Her lullabies were not solitary. They were part of a choir, invisible but unbroken. That choir was not celebrated in parades. It was not remembered in books. Yet it carried history itself, holding the world together when it threatened to unravel. She thought often of how songs shape memory. Soldiers remembered anthems of victory, nations remembered hymns of pride. But the children who survived remembered lullabies. They grew up carrying those tunes unconsciously, humming them while working in fields, singing them softly to their own children. They did not know it, but they were passing on the true anthem of survival. Her lullabies were not loud enough to stop a war. They did not silence cannons or halt armies, but they did something more profound. They kept alive the fragile flame of humanity inside ruins. They reminded those who listened that tenderness still existed, that care still had a voice. In that way, they were more powerful than any anthem sung under flags. Years later, when peace returned, she noticed how easily people forgot. They celebrated victories with parades, sang national hymns, and raised banners once again. But no one spoke of the lullabies that had carried them through nights of terror. No one honored the voices of women who had sung in darkness. She did not feel anger at this, only sadness. The world had forgotten its truest anthem. Yet the songs remained. They lived quietly in her children and grandchildren. Sometimes she would hear her daughter humming one while washing clothes, unaware of where it came from. Sometimes she caught her grandson whistling a tune that had once hidden bombs. Each time her heart swelled, forgotten by history, remembered by blood. That was enough. She realized then that lullabies do not need monuments. Their monument is survival itself. Every life carried through the war by song is proof of their endurance. She did not need statues or ceremonies. She needed only to hear her child laugh, to see him grow, to watch generations bloom. That was her anthem's legacy. The generals believed history would remember them, but their songs of war faded, while her lullabies lived quietly on, shaping tomorrow without fanfare. They were not sung in parades but in bedrooms, not shouted in victory but whispered in love. They were history's forgotten anthem, but also its truest. Her lullabies had become the anthem of survival, the song that carried life across the abyss of war. And though the world would never give them the honor they deserved, she knew the truth. No anthem sung under flags had ever been stronger. The cradle she rocked outlived the cannons. The war ended not with triumph but with exhaustion. Cannons grew silent, not because they had been defeated, but because even destruction has limits. Soldiers withdrew, villages smoldered, fields stood in ruin. The world exhaled a breath it had been holding for years, and in that breath came silence, thick, awkward, unfamiliar. For her, the end of war did not feel like victory. It felt like aftermath. Yet in her home, in the corner where the cradle still stood, there was a truth clearer than any declaration. The cradle had outlived the cannons. She touched it gently that first morning of peace. The wood was scarred, worn smoother by endless hands, stained by tears, marked by soot. Yet it stood. Its legs had not given way, its frame had not splintered, its rhythm had not broken. Through every night of thunder and every day of fire, it had carried children across fear. Now, in the silence of peace, it carried memory. She ran her hand along its edge and whispered, "You are proof." Proof that tenderness endures longer than violence. Proof that a mother's arms hold more weight than armies. Proof that what is built in love survives when what is built in hate collapses. The cannons had shouted themselves into rust, their voices swallowed by time, but the cradle still creaked, still whispered the rhythm of life. Her child, now older, no longer fit within its frame. He walked with sturdy steps, laughed with abandon, asked questions about a future he could finally imagine. Yet he returned often to touch the cradle, as though some part of him still remembered the safety it gave. "Why do you keep it?" he asked once, curious. She smiled, placing her hand on the wood. "Because it is stronger than cannons. Because it tells the truth better than books." Neighbors visited too, some bringing children born after the silence of war. They touched the cradle with reverence, remembering how it had carried not only her child, but theirs too, in nights when hope seemed impossible. One woman wept openly, pressing her forehead against the wood. "This cradle saved us all," she whispered. And in a way it had. The cradle became a monument, not of stone or marble, not sanctioned by governments, not recorded in history, but a monument of memory. It stood as a reminder that survival was written not in battles won, but in nights endured. While generals' names faded from memory, the cradle remained, passed down, carrying scars more meaningful than medals. Years later, when grandchildren filled her home, she would let them play near the cradle. They laughed, climbing in and out of it, pretending it was a boat or a fortress. She never stopped them, let them think it was a toy, let them know joy where once there had only been fear. Yet when they asked why she kept such an old, creaking piece of wood, she told them gently, "Because it is older than war, because it is stronger than fire, because it outlived the cannons." They giggled, not understanding, but she knew one day they would. The cradle became her greatest teacher. It taught her that fragility is deceptive, that what looks weak can endure more than what looks strong. It taught her that rhythm is stronger than noise, that constancy survives chaos. It taught her that history is not only written in treaties and battles, but in the quiet persistence of rocking through the night. She carried those lessons into every part of her life. On her final days, when her hands were too weak to rock anymore, she asked her daughter to sit by the cradle. "Rock it," she whispered, her voice thin but insistent. Not for the child, but for the memory. Her daughter obeyed, moving it gently back and forth. The sound filled the room, the same sound that had carried them through hunger and fear, the same rhythm that had never broken. She smiled through tears. "Do you hear? That is tomorrow, still alive." When she was gone, her family kept the cradle. Some suggested polishing it, repairing it, making it new, but her children refused. The scars were sacred. They told the story better than perfection ever could. The cradle remained as it was, worn, marked, yet enduring. And each time it creaked, her descendants remembered not just her, but the truth she carried. That love, expressed in the simplest acts, endures longer than war. Generals' statues toppled, their names forgotten. Cannons rusted in fields, their mouths filled with weeds. But the cradle remained, rocking quietly in homes, carrying life forward. It outlived the noise, outlived the destruction, outlived the arrogance of men who believed violence would define history. In truth, history was written here, in the rhythm of wood and hands, in the quiet strength of mothers who refused to let the future die. The cradle she rocked outlived the cannons, and in that fact lived the truest victory.